September 1560, 1 year and 10 months into the reign, and she's about to be hit with a massive scandal. This is not good. A female monarch in an age where female monarchs were not popular, particularly after her sister Mary I, all the trouble that she'd given for refusing to marry, the belief of some that her and Robert Dudley were actually lovers and waiting for Robert's wife to die, or made to die, such like, and that's what leads us on to a scandal involving the Queen, who we've just seen, Lord Robert Dudley here, and Amy, his first wife, maiden name of Robsart. This is a miniature of her by the famous female Tudor artist Lavina Turlick. Amy was born in 1532 in Norfolk, the same year as her husband here. An arranged marriage, as so many were in those days. The marriage between Robert and Amy was celebrated on the 4th of June 1550 at the Royal Palace of Sheen, with King Edward VI himself in attendance, so what seemed to be a pretty good start didn't really turn out that way. Unfortunately, as with so many aristocratic and arranged marriages of the time, Robert Dudley here and Amy just really weren't compatible. Robert being a courtier and living at court, the favoured courtier of a queen who did not like her male favourites to have other women in their lives. Really, they never had a home of their own. Their married life, really, I mean, don't forget Robert had been in prison under sentence of death or threat of death in the reign of Queen Mary alongside Elizabeth, and that's where that friendship was formed. But yeah, Robert, when the Queen came to the throne, spent near all his time around the Queen. He would go and visit his wife, but she spent her time travelling from house to house, staying with friends, really. It was a luxurious life, but a bit of an itinerant one, if you know what I mean. It was around about this time that the relationship between Elizabeth and Robert started getting very serious, especially in the eyes of some of the courtiers. She had made him the Master of Horse, a very prestigious position, which meant that you were in close contact with the Queen. Literally, the Master of Horse was one of the very few people that was actually allowed to lay his hands upon the Queen. The scandal and rumour mill and gossip got going right from the start, really. There were several severe cases of people saying things that they really shouldn't. From my own research and what I know, one was an old woman from Brentwood called Mother Dow, who said that the Queen only goeth on progress but to be delivered, and that she have borne Lord Robert Dudley several bastards. This she gossiped around, and it got back to the authorities, and the woman was arrested and put in prison. The closeness between Elizabeth and Robert really started to frighten some of the courtiers, particularly William Cecil here. Cecil and Dudley weren't really that great friends, particularly at the beginning. And Cecil thought, oh my god, this Queen is going to marry this man who is not a royal, whose father and grandfather and brothers were all executed traitors. Once he because he was very high-handed, was Robert, and Cecil knew that if the Queen married him, she would regret it. Even Walsingham here, who was slightly more friendly towards Lord Robert Dudley, didn't want the marriage either. None of the courtiers wanted it because they knew that Robert Dudley as king would be absolutely unbearable. Which takes us back to the scandal and the accident. Well, so-called accident. Which takes us to Cumnor Place and the 8th of September 1560. Amy Dudley, as I've said, travelled from place to place staying with friends, and it was the Forsters who she was staying with this time at Cumnor Place. On the 8th of September there was a fair at Babington, where Cumnor Place was located, and what really raised the suspicion later on was that Amy basically forced even her own servants, and some of them who weren't servants, out of the house so she could be alone for some reason. No one knows why to this day. Some say that there'd been a meeting arranged between her and Robert Dudley because he wanted to divorce her. No one knows, and as I say, this is an historical whodunit that has never been solved until this day. So, the fair on, and everyone sent away, to some of the residents' annoyance, I may say. Amy was completely alone in the house, apart from old Mrs. Forster, who lived at the other end of the house, who she couldn't send out and force away, and she kept to her own quarters. When the servants and everyone returned from the fair, they found Amy Dudley like this, dead with a broken neck at the foot of a very short flight of stairs, a double staircase. Dudley, who was at Windsor with the Queen when this happened, a messenger was sent straight away and arrived at Dudley the next day and told him of the news of Amy's death. Both flying into a panic, the Queen would not see Dudley, and an inquest was ordered to be put forward till the verdict came out. But Dudley, being a man that did not just want to leave things as they were, which shows that he may well have been innocent of this crime that he was accused of, did everything in his power to try and have it properly looked into. He immediately wrote to his steward, Thomas Blount, who had himself departed for Cumnor. He desperately urged him to find out what had happened and to call for an inquest. This had already been done when Blount arrived. He informed his master that Lady Amy Dudley had risen early, and these are the words, and would not that day suffer one of her own sort to tarry at home, and was so earnest to have them gone to the fair, that with any of her own sort that made reason to tarry at home, she was very angry, and came to Mrs. Oddingsell's, who refused that day to go to the fair, and was very angry with her also, because Mrs. Oddingsell said that it was no day for a gentlewoman such as herself to go unto a fair. Whereunto my lady answered, and said that she might choose and go at her own pleasure, but that all hers should and must go, and that if any did tarry, she would be greatly angry therewith. Robert was controlling the proceedings as much as he could through Blount, through speedy messengers going to and from. Mrs. Peto, who was Amy Dudley's maid, and had been forced out to the fair on that day, was roundly questioned by Thomas Blount, because Dudley, and particularly Blount, whose livelihood was paid for by Dudley, did not want Dudley to be seen as a murderer, and many questions were asked. And Blount asked Mrs. Peto that did she think that Amy Dudley may hath an evil toy in her mind, which by their wording means, did she kill herself? Was she depressed, and did she kill herself? And Mrs. Peto really rounded on him and sternly said that she do by her faith doth very chance, and neither done by man nor herself. For herself she said she was a good virtuous gentlewoman, and would daily pray upon her knees and divers times, and said that she heard her pray to God to deliver her from desperation. Then said he, she might have an evil toy in her mind, suicide. No, good Mr. Blount, said Peto, do not judge so of my words, and if you should so gather, I am sorry I said so much. So Mrs. Peto didn't think it was suicide, but the pray daily for deliverance thing comes into interesting territory. It was said at the time that Amy Dudley had a malady in her breast, which was a cancer, and that she was dying of that, and that Lord Robert was really waiting for her to die so that he could marry the Queen. After having died in such suspicious circumstances, even though the inquest did find that, or rule that it was an accident and was very chance, but the suspicions never went away, because it was a pair of staircases, so you'd have to fall down one, roll across a little landing, and then fall down another and break your neck, which even the Tudors, who didn't have forensics and everything, knew that was a near impossibility. So with the death of Amy here, that put pay to the chances of Lord Robert ever marrying the Queen. As a new Queen, and the suspected bastard of Mark Smeaton and Anne Boleyn, this Queen could not risk a jot of scandal, and more importantly she didn't want to marry either. Which leads us on to the theory of who did murder Amy Dudley. Some said it was Lord Robert. Mary Queen of Scots here, over in Scotland, joked that the Queen shall marry her horsemaster, who hath killed his wife to make room for her. So suspicion fell on Dudley, first of all, and on the Queen as well. It's very highly unlikely that Dudley would have had her killed, because the slightest of suspicion he knew would have ruined his chances of ever marrying Elizabeth, which it did. So some say that that ruled him out of the innings of the killing of Amy Dudley. Some say that the Queen herself had Amy killed, that she loved Lord Robert, but she didn't want to marry him. And so some say that a plot was schemed, either by the Queen on her own account, to have Amy killed, so that Robert Dudley and the Queen could never marry. And a very good and popular theory really is that Cecil here, the chief minister, who knew that if Dudley became king his days were numbered, some say that he had Amy murdered, and that he may have done so to kill two birds with one stone. The woman was dying of cancer possibly, so he may have seen it as a mercy killing. Also, the killing and the weird circumstances in which she was found, he knew that suspicion would fall on Dudley, and possibly on the Queen, and that they could never marry for that reason. So yeah, that's the little theory of the Amy Dudley, Robert Dudley and the Queen scandal, which happened not that long into the Queen's reign, so to be touched with scandal so soon was not a good thing. And as I say, it became a little bit of a joke and a laughing stock kind of thing, even Mary Queen of Scots, as I've said. And after all that, the Queen knew that she could never marry Lord Dudley or Robert Dudley, so yeah, that put paid to that one. So on to our next big event of Queen Elizabeth's life. So you've had scandal, and there you get plot, which is the Babington plot, which will lead us on to Mary Queen of Scots. So scandal, plot and Mary Queen of Scots. The Babington plot is the next big thing that happened later on in the reign. So on to that now. Which leads us on to one of the greatest troubles of Queen Elizabeth's life, which was the Babington plot and Mary Queen of Scots. Here we're seeing Queen Elizabeth in the rainbow portrait, and this dress is very symbolic because sewn onto the dress are eyes and ears, and that was symbolic to let everyone know that the Queen's eyes and ears were everywhere, so to behave yourself. Here is Mary Queen of Scots, the greatest protagonist of Queen Elizabeth I, greatest female one anyway. And this is said to possibly be a portrait of Babington, who started the plot. The Babington plot was a plan in 1586 to assassinate Queen Elizabeth I, who was a Protestant, and put Mary Queen of Scots, her Catholic cousin, on the throne of England to replace Elizabeth. The long-term goal of this plot, involving Babington, Mary Queen of Scots and King Philip of Spain, was the invasion of England by the Spanish forces of King Philip II and the Catholic League in France, leading to the restoration of the old Catholic religion. The plot was discovered by Queen Elizabeth's chief spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham here. By this point of Mary Queen of Scots' imprisonment, her jailer was this man here, Sir Amyas Paulet, brought in to replace a much more lenient man who came before him. Paulet was not lenient and had no liking for Mary Queen of Scots. Mary Queen of Scots was a real seductress, and several of her jailers, she had them wrapped around her little finger. This man she did not at all manage to achieve that with. Through the coercion of this man, Walsingham here, and many others in the spy network, the Babington plot was discovered fairly early on, but it was allowed to carry on for a very specific reason. Burley here, Walsingham and Robert Dudley, practically the whole government of England, including the Privy Council of England. By this point, Mary had been suspected of plotting before, and they all wanted her dead because she was a great threat to Elizabeth's life and safety. So as I say, the plot was uncovered fairly early on. The chief conspirators were Anthony Babington, Sir John Ballard, bear with me. Ballard was a Jesuit priest who hoped to rescue the Scottish Queen. Working for Walsingham as double agents were Robert Pauley, Gilbert Gifford and Thomas Philippus, a spy agent and cryptanalyst. Mary and her conspirators had a pretty good scheme going with the smuggling in and out of letters. In those days everyone drank wine and beer, water was too dangerous. So in the barrels brought into Mary's places of residence were bungs, you know, like cork bungs, but inside the cork bung was a secret compartment where messages could be hidden, and that's how a lot of these messages were taken in and out. Once Walsingham discovered the letters, he knew he'd got her. They knew that they'd got her, so they allowed it to carry on and ferment, shall we say, because they knew what she was about. They upped the security around the Queen to make sure the Queen was safe, but they let this one go on because they wanted Mary to basically admit in her own hands and writing that she, the Queen of Scotland, renounced and denounced, they're called a whore and everything, Queen Elizabeth's own cousin, wanted Queen Elizabeth dead. They needed that proof. They needed her to say it or write it, that she was willing to go along with that. And after patience and carrying on, that's what happened. And this is how they caught him, because Walsingham's decipherer forged this cipher postscript to Mary's letter to Babington, and it asked Babington to use the broken cipher to tell her the names of the other conspirators, because it was all written in code and they needed the code. And this is how it was done. Once that was done, it was cracked and everything went smoothly on. Mary didn't suspect anything, Babington didn't suspect anything. At first even the Queen wasn't alerted to it. The spy masters and Walsingham and everything knew what was happening, because they knew the Queen would fly into a rage and they wanted things to progress nicely in their own way. Sir Amyas Paulet here, as I said, no friend to Mary Queen of Scots, was quite happy to let the woman go on incriminating herself, and he put on a good show as well. No one let her know what was going on, so she went there sitting thinking, I'm going to be Queen soon and Elizabeth will be dead. But what she didn't know is that she'd basically screwed herself and really signed her own death warrant. John Ballard, the Jesuit priest, was arrested on the 4th of August in 1586, and under torture he confessed and implicated Babington. Although Babington was able to receive the letter with the postscript, he was not able to reply with the names of the conspirators as he was arrested already. Otherwise were taken the prisoners on the 15th of August 1586, Mary's two secretaries, Claude Neo and Gilbert Curl, and a clerk, Jerome Pasquier, were likewise taken into custody and interrogated. The conspirators were sentenced to death for treason and conspiracy against the Crown and the Queen's Majesty, and were brought to be hung, drawn and quartered. This first group included Babington, Ballard, Chidiock, Chichborne, Thomas Salisbury, Henry Donne, Robert Benwell and John Savage. A further group of 7 men including Edward Habington, Charles Tilney, Edward Jones, John Charnock, John Travers, Jerome Bellamy and Robert Gage were tried and convicted shortly afterwards. Ballard and Babington were executed on the 20th of September 1586, along with the other men who had been tried with them. Such was the public outcry at the horror of their execution that Elizabeth changed the order for the second group of men to be allowed to hang full dead before they were cut down and disemboweled and quartered, because it was a bloody, nasty, brutal affair, hanging, drawing and quartering, and it was done so even the public was like, well, no, this is a bit too much. So the Queen, who really knew well how to court the loyalty and popularity of her people, listened and commuted the sentence of the other group of men to be properly hung before they were cut down. In October 1586, Mary was sent to be tried at Fotheringay Castle in Northamptonshire by 46 English lords, bishops and earls. She was not permitted legal counsel, not permitted to review the evidence against her, nor to call witnesses. Portions of Felipe's letter translations were read at the trial. Mary was convicted of treason against England and against the Queen's Majesty. One English lord voted not guilty. The rest all voted guilty. Elizabeth signed her cousin's once removed death warrant. And this is what we're seeing here, the death warrant of Mary Queen of Scots, signed. But Elizabeth was terrified of the thought of killing a monarch, lest the same should happen to her. And she was her cousin as well, so she held back and signed this and said this is not to be released until I say so. Well, this is where it goes a bit iffy. Cecil here, and Walsingham, even Dudley, who knew the Queen would be very angry for what was to be done, and the whole Privy Council all agreed that Mary needed to die. So a front man was brought forward to take the blame, the secretary, and he sent the letter to Fotheringay, the order to have Mary executed, which Elizabeth didn't know about, so they say. Some say that she had no idea about it, some say that she knew about it and put on a great display afterwards of anger and grief that her cousin Mary Queen of Scots had been executed, which she was, in the great hall of Fotheringay Castle, in front of 300 witnesses. On the 8th of February 1587, Mary Queen of Scots was executed by beheading. And here is a contemporary woodcut of that execution. The courtiers and the Privy Council knew that this was going to be a big thing, whatever way it was put. So the execution was done inside, which was fairly unusual for the time. Not unheard of, but fairly unusual for the time. Anyway, Mary, a die-hard Catholic to the last, knew that she would die. So she kept her dignity as well. She was a brave woman. You have to admire her courage for this one. On the morning of her execution, she dressed in a dress of deepest black. She had her best wig put on her head. By this time, the slightly frail and aging Mary, Queen of Scots, middle-aged by this time, had arthritis. And what they didn't know is that under that lovely wig, Mary was bald. She made her way into the great hall of Fotheringay Castle. A Protestant priest came forward to offer to say the prayers, and she refused him, and he carried on praying, so she prayed in her Catholic prayers louder than he did, with a Roman Catholic prayer book. Once she'd done, she knelt down at the block. It took 3 blows of the axe to sever Mary's head, the second of which was the one that killed her. Afterwards, the executioner, as was done, lifted the head up and said, "Behold, the head of a traitor, and so die all the Queen's enemies." And this is where people didn't know that Mary was bald. They thought the wig was her hair. It fell off, the head and wig parted, and Mary's head rolled across the floor, and they discovered that the hair underneath was going grey and shorn very short. After Mary's execution, the order was given by the Privy Council that no thing that had been on the Queen or of the Queen on that execution was to survive: the clothing, the dresses. They didn't want relics for a martyr, because Mary had played a good game when she came down for her execution. When she took off her outer black gown, underneath was a gown of deepest red, the Catholic colour of martyrdom. So Mary had set out to be viewed as a martyr by her death, which kind of a little bit happened, really. It caused a lot of outrage. Mary was executed, everyone witnessed it and was sent away. When Mary's body was there, under her skirt was found to be her little dog that was soaked in blood, and the dog had to be taken away and washed. Luckily they didn't kill the dog. But yeah, everything about her basically was destroyed, but there are quite a few of Mary's possessions still around. Elizabeth, as she always did when something happened that she didn't want to be blamed for, flew into a rage and blamed everyone else, saying that the order had been stayed until she gave the order and it was sent without her consent, and that she never wanted her cousin's death. People were punished and they was let off pretty quickly afterwards, which pretty much says the truth of it. But Elizabeth knew that Mary had to die, and she died, whether Elizabeth wanted it or not, which she probably did, but she didn't want to be the one to seem to have done it. Because that leads us on to our next story in our next part of the video, which will be for another part, which is King Philip of Spain here. Himself, the Holy Roman Emperor, the Catholic League, everyone was so outraged at what had happened at Mary's death, and they called Elizabeth a murderess and Mary a martyr. And the outrage spurned and brought on what Philip had wanted to do anyway. Philip had wanted to invade England for a while, to turn it Catholic again, and also in revenge, because don't forget you had Raleigh and Drake, who were really pirates and kept raiding the Spanish ships and robbing things, and it was pissing the Spanish off, and there was a lot of things. Philip and Elizabeth didn't like each other. There were a lot of hostilities between them, but the goal for King Philip was to invade England, and the spark that he needed to set that off was the execution of Mary. So, from the death of this woman and the rivalry, which will take us on to part 3 of our documentary in a little while, which you'll see next Sunday, that sparked off the Spanish Armada, which really should have gone against us, but amazingly, miraculously, some say, it didn't. But that was the end of the rivalry between Queen Elizabeth I and Mary Queen of Scots. And now we'll go and visit the last resting place of this executed queen. Here we're looking at Queen Elizabeth I's greatest adversary, Mary Queen of Scots. To use the words of Anne Boleyn about Mary Tudor, Elizabeth's sister, she is my death and I am hers, and that was Elizabeth and Mary. Tomb of Mary Queen of Scots here.
Queen Elizabeth I, greatest adversary, plotter, schemer, would-be Queen of England. When her son James, King James of Scotland and James I of England, came to the throne, he had his mother moved into a place of honour. Here you have Mary Queen of Scots.